Darius Jackson whipped his car into the lot, barely catching his breath as he snagged one of the last open spots, only for a large SUV to swerve in from nowhere, stopping just inches away. His grip on the wheel tightened as he watched the driver's door fly open. Out stepped a woman, all sharp angles and clenched fists, her eyes locked on Darius like he'd just personally wronged her. "Excuse me, that was mine," she barked, voice ringing loud enough to draw a few wandering eyes from nearby cars. Darius felt his patience teeter on the edge. It was a public spot, and he'd taken it fair and square. Still, he tried to defuse it. "Ma'am, it's just a spot. Plenty more if you circle around." But she wasn't interested in reason. "You know," she sneered, stepping closer, "people like you always think you can do whatever you want. Rules don't apply to you, right?" The words stung, but not because of their heat. It was the familiar undertone, that bitter undercurrent Darius had faced 100 times before. He took a breath, steadying himself, willing his pulse to calm. "I'm just here to shop, same as you," he replied, keeping his voice as even as he could manage. But the woman's mouth twisted, her tone sharper now. "Just here to shop? Maybe you shouldn't be here at all," she shot back, her eyes narrowing, as if assessing every inch of him. "You live around here? Doesn't seem like it." Darius clenched his fists, feeling his anger rise. "Not here. Not now." He told himself to walk away, but the accusations kept coming, her voice shriller with each word. "What's the matter? Can't think of anything to say." She smirked, her hands planted on her hips. "Maybe because you know I'm right." Darius felt a flash of anger, quick as a heartbeat. But before he could respond, she took it a step further, jabbing a finger toward him. "Or are you one of those cowards who hides behind excuses?" He took a breath, his voice low. "I'm going inside. This isn't worth the energy." "Oh, so you're just going to walk away?" Her words cut through the air as she stepped closer, blocking his path. "You people love to do that, don't you? Run away when you know you're in the wrong." Darius felt his pulse quicken, his hands itching to respond, but he held steady. He knew how this would look to anyone watching. A calm man holding his ground while someone pushed every button she could reach. It wouldn't matter what was true. In situations like this, perception was everything. He nodded toward the store. "Look, you've made your point. I'm not here to argue. It's a parking space." But the woman took a step closer, blocking his way, her finger jabbing toward his chest. "You're not walking away from this," she snapped, voice laced with something colder. "People like you, always trying to act above everything. You think you can just waltz into spaces that aren't yours." Darius clenched his jaw. He knew where this was going, but her words still scraped against old wounds. He took a small step back, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want to escalate things. Still, the woman only seemed to feed off his restraint. "You hear me?" She spat, her voice rising. "You can't just take what you want." She was inches from him now, her finger pressing into his shoulder, testing his patience. "Back up," he said, his voice steely now. "It's a parking space. Leave it alone." But his words only fueled her fire. She took another step forward, close enough that he could see the fury in her eyes, and she hissed, "You don't get to tell me what to do." The sound of shuffling feet caught Darius's attention. A small group had gathered nearby, some pretending to look at their phones, others openly staring. Darius knew what they were thinking, what they were probably assuming. In their eyes, it wouldn't take much for him to look like the aggressor. "Let it go," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. "This isn't worth it." But her face twisted, and before he could react, she shoved him, her hand striking his chest hard enough to knock him back a step. He stumbled, catching himself, shock flashing through his mind as he realized she'd actually put her hands on him. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. "You don't get to put your hands on me." But she only smirked, undeterred. "Oh, I'll do whatever I want," she sneered. "What are you going to do about it? Hit me back? I'd love to see you try." Darius fought to keep his composure. The anger simmered beneath his skin, but he knew what she was doing, baiting him, trying to make him lose control. He wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. "You don't scare me," she continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can come into our spaces, our neighborhoods, and just take over? You think people around here want you here? Darius took a deep breath, willing his heartbeat to slow. He didn't want to give her anything to work with. But she pressed on, stepping even closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You should be grateful people tolerate you at all," she spat, each word carefully calculated to cut deeper. "Because if it were up to me, you wouldn't be anywhere near here." Darius felt his patience snap, just a little, a crack in the calm he'd tried so hard to maintain. "You're way out of line," he said, his voice as steady as he could make it. "I'm just here to get groceries. You need to back off." But his words only seemed to embolden her. She laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the lot. "Back off," she repeated, her eyes gleaming. "You think you can tell me what to do? People like you, always so entitled, always thinking you can just take what you want and walk away." He felt the weight of her words, the implications heavy and sharp. It was no longer about the parking spot. It was something darker, something that went deeper than he'd realized at first. He could see it in her eyes, the satisfaction she got from trying to put him in his place, the way she seemed to revel in the control she thought she had. "You need to step back and let it go," he said again, his tone firmer this time. But she didn't. Instead, she raised her hand and, before he could even think to move, brought it down hard across his face, the slap echoing through the parking lot. The sting radiated across his cheek, a sharp reminder of everything she wanted him to feel. Humiliation, anger, powerlessness. For a moment, Darius stood there, his mind reeling, his thoughts scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The crowd around them had grown, and he could feel their eyes on him, their judgment already forming. But he couldn't just stand there. Not after that. He felt the heat of anger bubble up, but he controlled it, raised his hand just enough to send a message, and delivered a single, controlled slap back. It wasn't meant to hurt her, but it was enough to make her step back, eyes wide with shock. The woman's face contorted, her expression shifting from surprise to pure fury. "You hit me," she shrieked, loud enough to echo through the entire lot. "You animal, you're going to pay for this." She looked around, her gaze sweeping over the gathered onlookers, her voice growing louder with every word. "Did everyone see that? He hit me. This thug thinks he can hit a woman." Darius clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting as he saw phones come out. People already recording, their faces a mix of shock and judgment. He knew what this looked like, how quickly this could spiral out of control. "Ma'am, you hit me first," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I didn't want any trouble." But she sneered, her face twisting into a mask of disgust. "Oh, you're in trouble now," she hissed. "You think you can get away with this? Do you know who I am? I'll ruin you. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are." The threat hung heavy in the air, her words sharp and calculated, designed to make him feel the weight of her power. Darius took a step back, trying to gather his thoughts, to figure out how to de-escalate before things got worse. But she wasn't done. With a final sneer, she turned to the crowd, her voice rising again. "Someone call the police. This man assaulted me. He's dangerous." Darius felt his stomach drop as he watched her rally the crowd, her voice carrying an authority that made people pause, made them hesitate. He knew how this would look if the police showed up, how quickly things could spiral out of control. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the panic he felt rising within him. "You know that's not what happened. You hit me first, and I only reacted." But she ignored him, waving her arms, gesturing to the onlookers, who were already whispering among themselves, their phones still recording. Darius could see the narrative shifting, the way people's expressions changed as they took in her version of events. And then, as if to seal her victory, she pulled out her own phone and snapped a photo of him, her face twisted into a look of mock horror. "Smile for the camera, tough guy," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're done?" Darius clenched his fists, forcing himself to take a deep breath to keep his composure. He couldn't let her get to him, couldn't give her any more ammunition. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away. Not with the crowd watching, not with their lies hanging heavy in the air. Before he could decide what to do, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they drew closer. Darius felt a chill settle over him, the realization sinking in that this wasn't going to end well, no matter what he said or did. The woman's eyes lit up at the sound, a satisfied smile spreading across her face as she watched him. "Good luck talking your way out of this," she sneered, her voice low and triumphant. "You're about to learn a lesson you'll never forget." The sirens grew louder, and Darius's heart pounded in his chest as a squad car pulled up. The woman's smirk only widened, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes as she waved down the officers. Within seconds, 2 officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they surveyed the scene. "Right here, officers," the woman cried, her voice laced with urgency. "This man, he attacked me. I was just defending myself." The officers approached, their gazes shifting between her and Darius, who stood with his hands relaxed but tense at his sides, trying to keep his expression calm. He knew how quickly this could go sideways. He'd seen it before, situations where the truth didn't matter as much as who told it. The lead officer, a tall man with a clipped tone, turned to Darius first. "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" Darius took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I pulled into an open parking spot, and this woman confronted me, saying it was hers. She got aggressive, and I tried to walk away, but she shoved me and then slapped me. I reacted." He kept his voice steady, holding the officer's gaze. He didn't want to seem defensive or angry. He knew he had to present himself as calmly as possible. But before he could finish, the woman cut in. "That's a lie," she screeched, pointing at him with dramatic flair. "He hit me. He attacked me out of nowhere. I was terrified, officer." The officer looked between them, his gaze steady. "Ma'am, please let him finish." But she ignored him, her voice rising as she turned to the gathered crowd, pointing at Darius as if rallying them to her side. "You all saw it. He thinks he can do whatever he wants, and then when I stand up to him, he hits me. He's dangerous." Darius felt a pang of frustration as he saw a few people in the crowd nodding, their expressions sympathetic toward her. He could almost see the story taking shape in their minds, her words painting him as a threat. He felt the weight of their judgment, and a familiar sense of dread settled over him. "Sir," the officer said, turning back to Darius, "do you have any witnesses to corroborate your side of the stories?" Darius scanned the faces around him, his gaze landing on a few who had been there since the beginning, watching everything unfold. But as he looked at them, he saw their hesitation, the way they shifted their weight or looked away, unwilling to get involved. A flicker of hope rose as an older man in a brown jacket stepped forward. He raised a hand, his voice tentative but clear. "I was here when it started, officer," he said, glancing briefly at Darius before looking back at the officers. "From what I saw, the lady was the one who started it. She hit him first." The woman's face twisted in disbelief, and she jabbed a finger toward the man. "Are you serious? You're taking his side?" she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "Unbelievable." The officer nodded, taking in the man's words. "Thank you, sir," he said, making a quick note. "We'll take that into account." The woman's face contorted with anger, and she whirled back to Darius, her voice a furious hiss. "You think this little show is going to save you?" she sneered. "I'll make sure you pay for this." But Darius stayed silent, keeping his composure even as the tension simmered beneath the surface. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the way their judgments weighed heavy on his shoulders. He knew how easily this narrative could turn against him, how quickly things could escalate. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping aside while we sort this out?" But she crossed her arms, her gaze defiant. "Why should I? He's the one who attacked me. He should be the one in cuffs." The officer's patience visibly thinned, and he took a step closer, his tone firm. "Ma'am, we need you to step back." Reluctantly, she backed away, casting a final glare at Darius as if daring him to react. But he held steady, his expression calm, refusing to give her the satisfaction. "Sir," the officer said, addressing Darius once more, "we'll need to ask you both some more questions to understand exactly what happened." Darius nodded, his voice steady. "Of course, officer. I'm happy to cooperate." As the officers moved them apart to take statements, Darius felt a sense of dread settle in. He knew he was telling the truth, but he also knew how stories like this could play out, how quickly perception could turn against him. He glanced at the crowd, noticing a few people still filming, their phones pointed at him, capturing every moment. The officer taking his statement listened carefully, jotting down notes as Darius recounted the sequence of events in as much detail as possible, not leaving out a single word or action. But as he spoke, he could see the woman in the distance, her expression smug, her body language full of confidence as she talked to the other officer. She looked back at him once, her lips curling into a mocking smile, as if she already knew how this would end. When he finished, the officer nodded, his face neutral. "Thank you, sir. Please wait here while we confirm the details." Darius watched as the officers consulted briefly, their heads bowed, their voices low. He felt the weight of every second as he waited, his heart pounding, his mind racing with thoughts of how this might unfold. The woman's voice drifted over to him, loud enough for him to hear. "I was just minding my business, and he attacked me. I mean, look at him. He's clearly dangerous. I'm just trying to protect myself." Darius clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew he couldn't let her words get under his skin, couldn't let her bait him into reacting. But the injustice of it all gnawed at him. The way she twisted the truth, the way she played the victim, knowing full well how people would see her, how easily they'd believe her story. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead officer approached him, his expression serious but calm. "Sir, based on what we've gathered, it appears there was a physical altercation, but we have a witness who corroborates your side of the story. However, we still need to advise you both to avoid further contact with each other and to resolve any grievances legally." Darius felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that the woman wouldn't let this go. She had already proven how far she was willing to go to make him suffer, and he knew this was only the beginning. The officer's gaze softened slightly. "For now, you're free to go. If anything else arises, we'll contact you. Take care." Darius nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you, officer." As he turned to leave, the woman's voice cut through the air one last time. "You're lucky this time," she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "But don't think you're getting away with this. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Darius didn't respond. He walked past her, his steps measured, his face calm. But inside, a storm raged, the injustice of it all fueling a fire that he struggled to contain. He knew that she would spread her version of the story, that people would believe her lies, that he would be seen as the aggressor, the threat. But he also knew that he couldn't let her win, couldn't let her control the narrative. He would fight back, not with anger, but with the truth, with the calm resolve that she couldn't shake. As he left the parking lot, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their judgments lingering in the air. But he didn't look back. He walked forward, determined to hold his head high, no matter what she tried to throw at him. Darius drove home in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing on his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged unfairly, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, he wasn't going to let it end with her lies hanging over him. He'd had enough of letting others control his narrative. The next day he took action. Darius contacted the store where the incident had occurred, explaining the situation to the manager and asking if any security footage was available. After a moment's pause, the manager agreed to review the footage, sympathetic to Darius's calm and honest account. That small glimmer of understanding felt like a lifeline, and Darius clung to it. 2 days later, he received a call. The store's cameras had indeed caught the altercation, showing the woman's aggressive behavior and the slap she had landed first. The manager was willing to provide the footage as evidence if Darius decided to press charges. Relieved, Darius prepared his case, and within a week, he filed a formal complaint. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wanted accountability, and more than that, he wanted to prevent her from using her privilege to intimidate others. It was about standing up not only for himself, but for everyone who had been in his position before, silently swallowing the unjust accusations. The court date was set for 2 months later. During that time, Darius focused on his work and his life, though he couldn't entirely shake the memory of the incident. It followed him, a shadow cast over every encounter, every sidelong glance he caught from strangers who might have seen the video clips circulated online. But he kept his head high, resolved to let the truth emerge in its own time. Finally, the day arrived. Darius sat in the courtroom, feeling a mixture of apprehension and determination. Across the aisle, the woman sat with her lawyer, her expression smug, her demeanor unchanged from that fateful day in the parking lot. The proceedings began, and the judge listened carefully as both sides presented their statements. When it came time to present the video evidence, Darius felt his pulse quicken. The footage played in front of the courtroom, showing the woman's confrontational approach, the aggressive shove, and finally, the slap she'd landed before Darius even had a chance to respond. There was a moment of silence as the video ended, the truth now laid bare for everyone to see. The woman's face drained of color as she realized the strength of the evidence against her. Her confident demeanor faltered, and she cast a desperate look at her lawyer, who sat stone-faced, likely aware that their chances of swaying the case had just evaporated. The judge turned to her with a stern gaze. "The evidence is clear, and your behavior was not only reckless but an attempt to mislead both the authorities and this court," she said, her voice resolute. "This court finds you guilty of assault and defamation. You will be held accountable for your actions." As the gavel came down, Darius felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a quiet satisfaction that went beyond the verdict itself. It was a victory not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been falsely accused or unfairly judged. Outside the courthouse, Darius took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. He had done what he set out to do, and the truth had prevailed. As he walked away, his steps felt lighter, his mind clearer. He'd fought for his dignity, his voice, and his truth, and he'd won. For the first time in weeks, Darius felt truly free. This battle was over, but he knew it would always be part of a larger fight. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next with his head held high, knowing that he had stood up not only for himself but for the countless others who deserved the same justice.